Hello and welcome back to my channel and my Lewton retrospective, and today we're looking at Isle of the Dead. What a strange, morbid, grim film this is. It starts, the title card is superimposed over a print of Arnold Böcklin's painting Isle of the Dead, same title. Now let's take a little bit of time over this painting because the island in the film is actually the production design is based on the painting itself, so it's worth thinking about this painting for a little while. It was painted by Böcklin in the late 1800s. He actually did several versions of it, but they're all basically the same. Across this very still, quiet sea, there's this round island with very sheer cliffs, with sort of built-in caves or funerary sort of alcoves. And in the middle is some dark cypress trees, which are always symbolic of cemeteries and death. And a small boat is going across the water to this island, and on it there's an oarsman, and in front of him is this shrouded figure in front of what could be a coffin or it could be an altar. Now, it's a very strange painting. It's not gothic, it's not horror, there's very little action or sense of movement, it's very still, it's very quiet, it's very eerie. There's no sense of horror in it. There's no sense of the dead or crossing over into some dark zone. Instead, it's very peaceful, but sort of so peaceful that all life, all noise, all movement has been drained out to a kind of stillness. The reason why I spend some time discussing this is not just because of this film. All of Val Lewton's films take their lead from this painting. All of them carry that same sense of eeriness, rather than outright horror that we might expect from, say, slasher movies or zombie movies or gore movies. It's this weird sense of stillness, of eeriness, of death in life. That's what infects all of the Val Lewton movies, and we're going to see that the word infects is very important here. This movie particularly, but it actually is there in I Walked with a Zombie. It's there in all of the Val Lewton films. This painting seems to be a kind of the register. It seems to be the thing that sets the tone for all these movies. Now, this very grim, very morbid film has a very unusual setting. As far as I can tell from the dates, it's set during the First Balkan War in Greece in 1912. We know it's set in Greece because Boris Karloff is got a very silly hairstyle which is supposed to make him look Greek. It doesn't really make him look Greek. It looks like he's trying out for a boy band, but okay, it's supposed to make him look Greek. And at the start of the film, it starts in Boris Karloff's tent on the battlefield, forcing one of his officers to commit suicide. This officer has disgraced himself with cowardice, and Boris Karloff says, you've got to go out there and shoot yourself. So the first keynote of the film is that Karloff is forcing death. Then he takes this American journalist, they walk out across the battlefield, and Karloff is forcing, for a reason that I can't remember, it's something to do with medical quarantine, he's forcing the soldiers themselves to carry the dead bodies, not horses, out of the battlefield. And you've got all these moaning dead men all over the place. It's this weird world of death. It's very morbid for a Hollywood movie, you know. And what it does is, right from the beginning, it associates Boris Karloff as someone who is forcing others into death. He calls himself the watchdog of the living. When we get to the island, what we'll see is the island, when you first get there, it's sort of protected by a statue of Cerberus. Cerberus from Greek and Roman mythology was the dog, the three-headed dog that guarded Hades, the world of the dead. So this guards this cemetery. And Karloff points out this dog and says, this is the dog that protects the dead. And throughout the film, rather unsubtly, we keep going back to this figure of Cerberus, and we keep getting this comparison between Karloff and the dog, these two watchdogs. One is the watchdog of the living, one is the watchdog of the dead. But actually the film is subtly suggesting that it is Karloff who is the person who is pushing the living towards death, and Cerberus might be protecting those people on the Isle of Dead who are living. Bear with me, you'll see what I mean. We also find out that Karloff, in his past, was a brutal soldier who forced local townspeople to death because they didn't pay their taxes. So this is a little motif that runs all the way through the film. Now what happens is he takes the American journalist onto this island, and this is a cemetery island where his wife is buried. There's a very odd scene. They go to the tomb of his wife, right? Karloff comes out and says, hey, she's not there. The coffin's been opened and it's empty. He says it in a very sort of understated way, really. And then something very peculiar happens. They walk round the island, and suddenly they find that the island is populated. It's very curious that there's a house on the island, and inside it is this Swiss archaeologist and his friends who've holed up there hiding away from the war. It gives the film a weird kind of dreamlike feel. Are these people really there? Is it a dream of Karloff and the American journalists? You know, is it realistic that this house would be there on the island? You have to take a leap of faith in narrative terms. But in a dreamlike way, it's kind of fascinating. And what leads you up to thinking like this is, what happens is the American journalist leaves a light on the shore as they travel to the island. And when he looks back, the light has gone out. This is never explained in the narrative. We never know what happens to the light. And it feels to me like they've crossed over. It's like Dante or Orpheus going into the underworld. They've crossed over from this world of the living into another plane of existence. And these people on this island, although they're all explained away narratively, to me they seem almost like a sort of avatars of the dead. Among them is Skelton Nags, by the way, who was in The Ghost Ship. He plays a sort of Cockney salesman who dies straight away, but he's quite amusing. Anyway, so they're on this island with this group of people, and then one of them dies of the plague. And Karloff takes the advice of his doctor, who comes over to the island and says they cannot leave. They are put in lockdown. This is a very strange film to watch after COVID-19, because it's like a sort of weird, prediction of COVID. You know, they're locked down, they can't leave the island. There's a wonderful hand-washing montage where they're all washing each other's hand. They exercise social distancing, they can't touch each other. And Karloff becomes really rabid about it. He's like the COVID-19 authorities, advising Boris Johnson. It's kind of a weird film to watch after all that we went through. Now we come to an interesting aspect to this film. How do we deal with the plague? The doctor wants to deal with it medically, like those scientists who advised us during COVID-19. Karloff takes the doctor's lead, right, and becomes very strict, right? What's interesting about this is that the Americans and the Swiss in the film don't like this imposition. And a debate arises between the people on the island about what's the best way to handle this, a more human way or a more scientific way. And what's interesting about this for me is it kept reminding me of the novel La Peste by Camus, The Plague. Now, this was written in the 1940s, and many people think it was really about the Nazi occupation. And it was written in the height of existentialist philosophy. Camus and Sartre were the sort of leading lights of that. It was a book I read at school, and it's a book I've always loved. I've always cherished it. And it's about in French Algeria, where Camus grew up. He was actually a goalkeeper in a football team. Anyway, he grew up there, and in this town, Oban I think it's called, a plague develops, just like on the Island of the Dead in the film. And the book is about how a group of individuals, each of them has a different way of approaching it. Some try to fight it, some try damage limitation, people have different philosophical attitudes. And what comes out of Camus' book is the necessity of fighting the plague, the existentialist necessity to take action, right? And what is interesting in this film is that the doctor and the Boris Karloff character, the general, they take action. They take the existentialist idea that you've got to fight the plague. But what's interesting about this is that the American and the Swiss, right, who are represented in the film as coming from more enlightened, rational nations, they take an acceptance attitude. We've just got to accept what happens, put ourselves in the hands of fate, put ourselves in the hands of the gods. So a weird kind of dichotomy opens up in this film. Karloff, Karina, the lady who runs the house, they both come from the old traditional world of Greece with all its superstitions and its legends of the Vorvolika, this woman who is like a vampire who sucks away the energy of the living. And they believe that this is what is really on the island, not so much a plague. But it's they who are arguing for a scientific rationalist fight against the plague. The Americans are arguing, no, we just have to accept it. If we die, we die. It's a very curious aspect of this film. Again and again, in Val Lewton films, people from the old world, Europe, in this case Greece, are seen as riddled with superstition. They're almost in a living death of superstition. It stagnates them. It prevents them from developing forward. In this film, the Greek characters, there are 3 of them, they're so superstitious that they actually call into question their own spirit. Thea, the young girl, who Karloff and Karina, I think it's Karina, I forget her name, they believe that she's a Vorvolika, a vampire, and Thea starts to believe it herself because of the superstition from her culture and tradition. She even doubts herself. Karloff also, even though he's a general and he believes in rationality, can't help being overwhelmed by the superstition of his people, of his tradition. It's so interesting, this, because Lewton himself was a Russian emigre into America, and throughout these films, ordinary Americans are seen as they're young, they're fresh, they're rational, they're from a developing country, something new and fresh, which doesn't have the baggage of the old stories. But in all sorts of films like Cat People, for example, where the lead actress in Cat People, she comes from Romania, from the old lands, and brings with her this sort of disease, this infection of being a cat person. And her husband and the husband's friend in the, who he's going to be, is the woman he'll eventually go off with. They're the new couple of the 20th century who can't understand this old world. It's a fascinating dichotomy that Lewton sets up in all of his films. And what's really interesting in this movie is this living death, this stagnant world of, superstition which bears you down, is cancelled out, it's exorcised by another form of living death, right? And that is that there's a woman on the island, one of the people who's trapped in this plague zone. She suffers from catalepsy. So there's a bit of Edgar Allan Poe coming in here, because Poe was obsessed with catalepsy. This is this condition where you can seem to be dead. You stop breathing, your heart stops beating for hours, even days at a time, but you're actually still alive. And she, like Poe, is terrified of being buried alive. And she is buried alive. And this leads to the great horror moment of the film, which is brilliant. It's absolutely fantastic. She's scratching at the lid of the coffin. And then she gets out of the coffin. And later, in the darkness, the heroine, Thea, sees her, this kind of white shadow in the inky darkness of the tomb. A brilliant horror scene. But this woman, now in a living death, she's now mad and she's cataleptic. She is the one that will kill Karloff and exorcise his living death of superstition, this world that he's trapped in. And this will free the young American and the young Thea, the young people, to go forward into a new world, a new century, a new type of rationalism. And that's what you see in all of these movies. You see it in I Walked with a Zombie, you see it in Cat People. It's the same trope, Leopard Man, it's the same trope repeated over and over again. It's interesting that I Walked with a Zombie, there's a lot of comparisons here, because in I Walked with a Zombie, the nurse, who's the lead character, is looking after a wife who is somnambulist. She's in a kind of living death, like this cataleptic patient. And both the wife in I Walked with a Zombie and the cataleptic woman in I Love the Dead both throw themselves off a cliff into this, both throw themselves into the sea at the end. Interesting little comparison there. So there we go. So there's some things to look out for in this film. Not the best of the Val Lewton films, but a very rich film and a very strange, morbid, eerie film. Just like that painting by Arnold Böcklin. What was it called? Isle of the Dead.